Okay, welcome back. We're on page 267 talking about profit margin. And you can actually compare profit margins between organizations just basically to see either how well they're doing or how greedy they are. Okay, for example, the profit margin on Apple products is probably really high compared to the profit margin on a Dell computer, which is probably razor thin profit margins. Okay, so the next term they talk about is the life cycle costing. And another way of describing this thing is this thing called the total cost of ownership. You may have heard that before. And that is like, for example, let's say you buy a car and say, well, it's going to cost me $30,000. No, it's going to cost you $30,000 plus gas, plus maintenance, plus insurance, right? What's the total cost of ownership for a car? It's not the purchase price. Okay, all right. Same thing here. So life cycle costing, typically, for example, we talked about in the previous chapter about net present value. And if you spread it over 10 years, let's just assume that the life of your software project is going to be 10 years, then you're probably going to be, just spreading that over, and that's going to be your life cycle cost. What's the total cost of everything? And one of the things they talk about is if you're doing life cycle costing, don't skimp at the beginning. Okay, don't say, well, our costs are going to be low and they're going to ramp up. That's probably not correct. The costs at the beginning are going to be kind of high in the beginning part of these things, which is the planning and requirements for all that stuff. You know what we're talking about. All those process groups we talked about a gazillion times. So particularly don't skimp on anything dealing with requirements gathering. If you skimp there on your budget, okay. And of course, downtime is if you don't spend money getting the requirements correct, and then you have to stop the project and do it over again. There's a really cool little sidebar in the book talking about an example from Google. When Google had a downtime, it was like $66,000 a minute. That's how much revenue they lost for being down. Oh yeah. And trust me, if you were to say, well, I'm going to have to take the server down for 30 minutes, somebody's going to whip out the calculator and say, it's going to cost us $1 million. And well, how come you didn't consider that in the requirements? Well, it would have cost an extra $1,000 to do the requirements right. It's like, we're losing a couple million because you didn't want to spend $1,000 up front? What the hell's the matter with you? Okay, that's the point. Don't skimp on early phases of the project. Okay, so cash flow analysis, the next term on the list here. So this is basically an estimate of the annual cost and benefits. Cash flow analysis. It's used when you're doing that net present value guy over again. And so it's kind of sort of simple. If I run out of money in a particular month, that means I can't pay all my bills, right? Cash flow analysis. So if, for the easiest example, is if they doled out the money to me on a monthly basis. I told them I need $64,000 this year and $78,000 a month. First month, and then the second month, and the third month. I give them. I'm following an estimate on how much money I need each month. If I burn through it too fast, well, then I can't pay my bills, so to speak. So that's basically what that all is. Cash flow analysis. And even if they gave it to you in lump sum, you'd still want to do this cash flow analysis to see how fast you're burning through your cash. You still need it. The next one talks about tangible costs. And tangible costs are benefits, but I'm going to stick with cost. Basically, these things are easy. Tangible costs are things that are typically measured in dollars. Okay, I know how much the labor costs. I know how much a new server costs. I know enough how the licensing costs. Those are all tangible costs. Tangible costs are like, whip out my calculator, I could fix that one. Okay, intangible costs or benefits are those things that you really can't really tell. For example, the classic example of an intangible cost is, let's say I'm implementing a brand new system, and there's going to be a loss of productivity because before my workers be able to, punch out, 100 widgets a day. But with this new system, it's going to be a drop. Boom. They're going to be producing 60 widgets a day until they slowly get better at it. And hopefully when they're better, they'll be able to produce more than what they had before with this new system. Okay, but what's the cost associated with lost productivity? See, that's an intangible cost. It's like, yeah, I don't know. I mean, okay. Typically, you don't budget for intangible costs like that, but you do use that in your calculation for total cost of ownership thing. Okay. Another thing about intangible cost is, what happens if I piss off my customers and they quit buying my product? Or even a weird one. I have seen one of these where there was an intangible cost associated with we're working this group of programmers and we're behind schedule, and so we're paying them overtime. They're working 10 hours a day, for 6 days a week, and we're burning these guys out. And so is there a cost associated with burnout? Oh yeah. Their productivity is going to go down. They're going to need lots of vacation at the end. Maybe they're going to leave your company. Yeah, intangible. Okay, let's keep going. So, direct costs. So, direct costs are those things that are obviously caused by your project. I have to pay my salary, the salary of my people, plus the things that they consume, right? That's fairly obvious. But what's not so obvious is indirect cost. So, let's say, for example, that my software team is in a big building, okay? And I have 1/4 of the building, the HR and the budget folks and maybe some engineering folks, and the software folks consume 1/4 of the floor plan. So an indirect cost would be, well, should I be paying for 1/4 of the lease and 1/4 of the utility cost, 1/4 of the HR, because everyone goes through HR, 1/4 of the admin cost for the secretaries and the admin pool and the company officers, right? Because is that how it's supposed to work? So indirect costs could be those things that are not directly associated with the project, but somebody's got to have to pay the electric bill. And so do I owe my project? Do I budget in my project my prorated share of the lease? And typically the answer is no. But that's beside the point. The point is, indirect cost is how that works. So, the prorated share. All right, sunk cost. Now, if you've ever taken a finance course, they talk about this in great detail because it has an awful lot to do with human nature. So, sunk cost is money that you've already spent and you're not getting it back. Okay, that's the definition. And that's pretty obvious. If I spent money on something and there's no way I could return whatever it is, it's not like an item I could take back to the store. So this is cost that's been spent. In labor, it's fairly obvious, right? If I spent labor and then I find out I don't need it anymore, that's sunk cost. I'm not getting that labor back. Okay. Having said that, here's the funny part. Humans have this bizarre concept of, well, I've already spent $100,000 on this thing, and now I have to decide on whether or not I want to continue the project. Well, I've already spent $100,000. I might as well get something out of it. That's the wrong thinking. It's human nature to think that. By the way, the people in the slot machine business love this, right? I've already put in $100, so I need to keep on going. Well, that's the same idea. You're not getting that money back. So if you're making a decision on whether or not you want to continue with a project, it ought to be on the merits of that decision going forward. In other words, start with ground zero. It doesn't matter how much you spent. That's not relevant to your discussion. And it certainly is not relevant to your decision on whether or not you want to continue the project. So if you're going to say, if you get to a go, no-go point in your project, you ought not think about how much money you spent. I know it's kind of counterintuitive because it sounds like you should say, well, I spent whatever it is, $250,000 of my company and money, and dang, I don't want to be embarrassed if I'm not producing anything, so I think I'm going to go ahead and approve this project to go, even though the project is shit. That's going to get you into trouble. Okay, so one more time. You can't get the sunk cost back either way. If you decided to go or no go, you're not getting the sunk cost back either way. So you cannot use sunk costs as a justification Okay? I know that's not human nature, and you finance people are going, yeah, we already heard all this before. And it's a fight against human nature. Let's continue. Learning curve theory. And basically the idea is, and you know what we're talking about, if I'm only, as I produce more of these things and ramp up production, and I'm going to get a little better at it, and it'll go a little bit faster, it's going to cost me a little less. And so, as I'm learning, the cost is high, and as I figured it all out, the cost gets low. And that's why, the first run, it doesn't matter what it is you're buying, you're buying a, whatever it is, a kumquat. Well, the first kumquat you buy is going to be kind of expensive coming off the assembly line. But, if you wait a couple months, the price will drop. That's what we're talking about, is the fact that it takes a while for companies to gear up. The learning curve theory. Costs go down when volume goes up. Okay, we're almost to the end of these goofy terms. And the next one is reserves. And so the reserves is basically your buffer in the budget, okay? A portion of the estimate for contingencies. In the construction world, a classic example of this is weather delays. I know how much it's supposed to cost, but I'm going to put 20 weather days in there because that's just my contingency funds in case something goes wrong. And basically, if I'm staying within my contingency funds, we'll talk about the thresholds, right? Like plus or minus 10% or whatever it is. If I stay within my threshold, I basically don't have to go back to, Mother, may I have some more money kind of a thing. So in the software world, we're talking about, sudden employee turnover or things like that, or, mergers and acquisitions. I can tell you there was this really strange scenario that happened that I read about, not personally, where this company was working there, making a competing product. So company A had a pretty decent piece of software, and company B was making one that was better. Okay, so they're in direct competition with each other, making fantastic, competing products, and then they merged the companies together, and their project went. So, you want us to continue competing against ourselves? So that project got into a total tailspin of what it is that we're gonna do and not gonna do, and it was kind of crazy. They ended up not canceling the product, believe it or not. Anyway, so those kind of reserves where you just throw in some contingencies. Software contingencies could be all sorts of strange things, but mostly dealing with labor. Okay, we're done with finance and accounting terms. Aren't you glad? On page 270, they talk about the planning cost management. So this thing, right? The planning of the cost management. All right. So there's a bullet list on page 271. Let's just take a peek. And so here's what it basically says. Here's some of the things that you would consider when you're putting together your plan. All right. One of them is the level of accuracy. Have you guys ever noticed, like, when you put together your taxes, right, at the end of the year, you're not required to say, I made $60,487.12. You can leave off the 12 cents. In other words, their level of accuracy is to the nearest dollar. Yes, you can put in more, but same thing here. When you're doing budget kind of thing, I wouldn't go down. I mean, rounded to the nearest $100 would probably be okay. And so, yes. However, there could be some guidelines in your organization that say to the contrary. But outside of that, you need to determine, when you're putting together your plan, what is your level of accuracy that you want in your estimate. Okay, the unit of measure, almost always, outside of cost, which is fairly obvious in the U.S., but when you're talking about labor, is it going to be per hour or per day or per week? Again, what is the unit of measure that you're going to use? How fine-grained are you going to be? For example, on a long-running project, you might pick days. If it was a project that's going to take a couple of months, maybe it would be hours. Okay, this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll catch you guys again in just a few.